Hello, my name is Surname and I'm doing Excel for accountants. Today we're looking at breaking up a list of names into first name, middle name and surname. Now, I worked for quite a long time in the banking and insurance industry, and I often would get lists where the first name, middle name and surname is all concatenated into one single string. And then I would need to break it up into multiple records. And it sometimes poses a little bit of a challenge, and I'm going to show you why it does, and the method that I found to as a workaround to be able to do this. So I'm going to jump to my sheet 5 on here, and I'm going to show you. We've basically got a list here, and I just made up some names. And generally, the quickest and easiest way that I've seen people use is by going to data. You select the list, you go to data, text to columns, and you say it's delimited field, and you go next, and you say it's space delimited, and finish. And voila, you have the entries broken up into components. However, this breaks every single entry. So you might have a person like this that's got quite a lot of names, and it breaks it up into multiple fields, but you can see that surnames are, for instance, not all grouped together. So it means that you would now either have to write a little macro or write a little program that's going to fix this for you and put all the surnames underneath each other and all the first names underneath each other, and maybe a field in the middle that's got all the middle names. So this is not the ideal way of doing it. Now, there is a way of doing it directly in Excel. And this is a method that I basically copied from somebody else on the internet. And you can see that the formula is extremely complicated. You're going to find that very few people will actually be able to put this formula together, and it doesn't exactly do what we need it to do. Now, I've got these segments that I've color coded, so I'm going to run through this and I'm going to show you what it's doing and why I don't like this method. So this is basically the data that you have been given. Similar to that first list that we just look at. So I'm going to just make it a little bit wider so you can see the full name there. So the formula that we'll be using is basically this section here in red. And we're going to be inserting it in this section. So the output of this would be this section that I'm going to just make pink. So it is putting the last name and the first name underneath each other, and it's putting the middle names, concatenating it into a single field. However, what you notice is that somebody like Josephine van der Merwe being a surname, it's only taking the last part of the name and not putting the van der with the Merwe in the last name. So it's assuming that because there's spaces in between, it's part of the middle name, which is incorrect. So I'm going to run through this formula anyway, just to show you how it works. And then I'm going to show you the method that I prefer, and the reason why I prefer using VBA over multiple formulas that becomes extremely complex and time consuming to put together. So what this formula does is, the first thing that it does is it uses the let statement. Now, the let statement allows you to give names to certain segments of your code. So we basically can give a name segments to the breakup of that name. And what it essentially does is it takes that name and splits it. You can see the text split section is there. So it's text splitting this, and what you and using this space as the splitter, as the item that's breaking it up, and you basically then get an array of multiple parts, however many parts. I've just worked up to 8 because I built a name that has 8 components in it, and it basically then uses that, breaks that name up into an array. So you can see there's one formula in here, and that one formula creates this entire array in here. Now, what it does then is, so that's your segments part. Then it does a count, and the count basically, it's basically this portion. So it's a count of all the individual parts that make up each one of these lines. So every one of these will have a different count. Now, for the purpose of this explanation, I used the biggest name just so I could show you how it steps through it. And then it goes and creates a name called first. And the first is basically it's an index. So it's taking this, and which consists of 8 parts, and it's indexing that array and saying it's calling the first part, the first section of that array. Now, the reason why they're doing this, using this let statement, is it allows them to name certain sections. Each part of this gets a name like segment. This part is called code. This part is called first. This part is called last. And you can then afterwards use that, that count, for instance, is used here, the reference to this portion of the code, or of the formula. And first is used here, and last is used here. So they are referring to, and segments is used here, so they're referring to the names that they've given each one of these sections of their formula. So then we have one that is called last. It's also an index, but it's referring to the last part of this. So essentially what they're doing is they're extracting the first and the last, which they assume is the first name and the last name. And as we saw, it is incorrect because technically von is also part of that last name. Then they go and break the, so they then take all these individual segments that is here, all 8 segments, and I've put them in here so you could clearly see what is happening. And they then stack these components together. So they're saying that if so here where the if statement start after so this is the last part they've specified, and then they do an if statement. So the ifs says if the count is 1, in other words there's only one name, one part, then what it is going to do is it's going to do this. It's going to H stack it, basically taking the array and just stacking the first part of that segment, and then the next 2 parts is nothing because it doesn't have a middle name and it doesn't have a surname because there is only one name. It's say for instance it's Peter, but you didn't record a surname or middle name in there. So that would be the format then if there's only one part. If there's 2 parts, they assume there's only a first name and a last name. And so what they do is the exact same thing. They H stack it, and they use the first and the last name. Whereas in the first one they use only the first name and two portions that it has nothing in it. And then they said if it is greater than 2, then they're going to H stack it in by calling the first part for the first name and the last part for the last name. And then they're going to take all of the segments together, but they're going to drop the first segment. You can see they do a drop there with the segments, that's all of the segments, and they comma 1, so they're dropping 1 column. And then they do a second drop within it where they drop comma -1, so in other words the last segment. So what they left with is basically everything in the middle, which is how they get to the middle name. And this is how they did this formula, which is which doesn't work exactly the way I would like it. And you can imagine if the formula already looks like this. If we now have to go and determine which parts of these are also a surname or part of the surname, then this formula is going to grow by magnitude, because you're basically going to have to go and check from the you're going to assume that the first one is definitely a first name, but then from the second one you're going to have to check each one of them to see if it is if it could possibly be part of the surname. because he might only have, let's say he's only got there's only 4 components like this one. So from this, van den Berg is this person's surname. So from this point, you would need to also build into this formula something that will check if van is part of the possibilities and den is part of the possibilities, and Berg, because it's the last one, you would assume that that is correct. So you can imagine how this thing is going to grow, because you're kind of going to be getting, if it consists of 8 components, you're going to get a formula that is pretty much 8 times the size. It's really only the first portion with the let and the segments and the count, the first and the last, that's going to be, but all of this you're going to basically repeat 8 times, or you're going to have to build something that has a greater than check, but for each one of to be able to check each one of these fields whether it is actually part of a surname. So it is not really a method that I would think is useful for an accountant that is busy to sit for hours and try and figure out how to put a formula like this together. So I'm going to show you a Visual Basic way of doing it, which is a lot shorter. What we basically get in Visual Basic is we're going to get a formula that is, I'm just going to press F9 to recalculate. Sorry, I'm going to copy that, just paste it down. So here you can see we're actually getting the correct information, and we have the data that we received. We have a single helper column, and then here all we're doing is we text splitting, because what we've done is basically put a hash in between the first name, all the middle names, and the last name. So there's 2 hashes in there, and it's just basically splitting those hashes out, using those to break it up into columns. So you basically have a formula that says breakup name, and we have the cell name that we want to break up, and then we have the surname prefixes, and I'm going to show you the surname prefixes. It's a straightforward little spreadsheet that I've just basically put in all kinds of prefixes that is likely to be part of a surname. There's obviously a lot more than this, but I've put these couple in. It is not case sensitive. The way we wrote the code, it can be uppercase or lowercase that you enter in here. It doesn't matter. But this is basically what you then would need. And the code itself is 1 page of code. This is it. That's all of the code. And you can see a big portion of it is just us declaring option explicit and declaring our different variables. So I did not put these. I should put in a string, middle name as string, surname as string. Surname flag is going to be as Boolean. Cut position is integer. Snippet is string. Key is an integer. Max key is not necessary because I've changed the method that I was doing it. And then dim running is also Boolean. So what am I doing here? I'm basically passing the variable. So you can see it in the formula here. Going back here, sorry, to my VBA workings. So I'm passing the value that we want to break up, and I'm passing the name of the sheet where we're going to put the prefixes down. And that is it. Then in my code, I basically reset all my variables. So I change my key to 0. My first name is going to be a double quote because I don't want anything in the first name when it starts. I don't want anything in the middle name when it starts, nothing in the surname when it starts. And then running is basically just going to determine whether this loop will continue to run. So I say do while running is true. And from the do to the loop is where that this portion is going to keep on running until the do while running becomes false. Then I take the key, which is 0, and I add 1 to it. And then I use an in string. So basically from I take that variable that I've passed, so I just called it passed variable, and that is the name, the full name that we've passed from our Excel spreadsheet, and I check it to find if there's any spaces in it. So if there's a space in it, it's going to return a value, the position of where that space is. And if it is greater than 0, in other words, there is a space in it, then running is going to remain true. But otherwise, it's going to change it to false. And if it's false, this loop will end when it gets to the end, or when it gets to the end and loops back to the start, it will see the do while running is now false, so it's not going to continue the loop. Then I basically do a cut position. So the cut position, the cut position is basically, the cut position is basically my position of this in string. And why am I returning this? It's because I want to first check if my cut position is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, it means that there is still another space that can be cut. If it equals, so I've got one condition that of steps that it's going to do. If it can cut one space out, in other words, if it can still trim one name out of the equation. If it can't trim another name out of the equation, it means it's at the surname, it's at the last entry, and then it's going to have its own set of conditions that it's going to follow. So if there is still names to be trimmed, then what it's going to do is it's going to first take, it's going to basically take a snippet. So the snippet is the name that is in that full first name that's being passed to us. So it's basically going to get that name by using the mid function on the passed variable from character 1 until the cut position -1. -1 because we don't want the space as well. We want it without a space. And then I'm going to use basically use a workbook function. So, but I'm calling it by means of application.match. You will see if you try and use this function by saying workbook function like we've done with some of our other stuff, it returns an error. It cannot return it. It comes up with an error. But if you call it a match function, you can call it by application.match. And then so if it, in other words, if there's not an error, it means that it found the entry on our sheet that's got our surname prefixes, and then it's just going to flag it. It's going to flag the surname flag. It becomes true. Otherwise, the surname flag is false. And this is going to tell the program whether it belongs to the surname or to the middle name. Then the passed variable basically gets trimmed by taking the right position. In other words, it's going to basically take the name that we've now extracted into snippet out of the passed variable. So the next time we run past this variable, it's going to be a little bit shorter because the name that we extracted into the snippet is going to be out of it. And then if the key, in other words, in our first round, the key is going to be 1. And then it means it's definitely part of the first name. So I'm setting then the first name equal to snippet. If the key is greater than 1, then it's just going to check whether the surname flag was adjusted to be false or true. If it is false, then it's going to add it to the middle name. So it's going to take the middle name. I'm putting a trim in there because I'm adding spaces in. And so when I take the middle name and I add a name in it and a space, sometimes what happens is you get extra spaces. So I constantly trim this function, but I do want spaces in between the different names in the middle name. So and also in the surname. So for that reason, I'm adding the spaces, and then I just trim the additional spaces. In other words, any space in front or behind it, I'm trimming out of the equation. But any space in between, it will remain. So if it is then part of the middle name, it will add it to the middle name. So it's going to take the middle name and take and equals it to the middle name. In other words, what is the middle name that it had on the previous pass, and then add the new name to it, the snippet to it. And it's going to do the same if it is a surname. It's just going to add it to the surname by taking equals to the surname and the snippet. Then it's going to continue doing that. So it's going to loop through this for each one of the positions. That so if the name has 8 middle names, it's going to run through it 8 times to be able to get to the to build up that name bit by bit. If it gets to one where it's marked it now as a flag, a surname, the surname flag is true, then instead it's going to add it obviously to the surname. And if it gets to cut position equals 0, in other words, it's doing the in string, but there is nothing to cut anymore. There is no more spaces. Then it means it's at the last position. So then it's going to automatically take that snippet, and it's going to pass it to it's going to put it into the surname. And then it marks running as false. When it gets here, then running is definitely false because there's nothing more to do. After it's taken the last part of that name, the string on the next pass, if it was going to pass, the string would be empty because it would take the last part of that string out of it when it gets to this passed variable. But it's not going to get there because it will realize that there is nothing more to cut, and therefore it will end the program. It will mark it as false, and the loop will terminate when it gets to the top again. Then what I do is I take the breakup name, which is our function name, and I take the first name that I've collected. So in other words, it's the first name that we got on the first pass, and then it adds a hash signal sign to it, and then it adds the middle name. So the middle names is going to be all of the middle names with spaces in between it. It's going to add to it next, and then it's going to add another hash, and it's going to add the surnames. So if there's 3 surnames like Van der Merwe, then it's going to add Van der Merwe at the end of this. Okay, so then this is the formula that will be passed to wherever you've entered your formula. And then it is literally as simple as everything. You can see everything is split up by hashes. So your main name, all your middle names, and then another hash that separates the middle names from the surnames. So it's as simple then as using text split, the value that you want to split, and the hash sign, and it will then populate it correctly in the correct columns where you need them. So the same method can be used, for instance, for something like let's say you've exported a ledger and the columns are getting all mixed up. You know, you have some columns that you've exported into Excel and an amount is sitting where a name is supposed to be, or something like that. Then you could do the same thing. Instead of the flag that I used to separate the middle name and the surname, you can then use a flag to check whether it is an amount or whether it is a value, a string. And use that method to separate it and to decide which column to move the value into. So you can use the same application for any kind of data where it is not coming across in the right format that you actually need it in. You know, in accounting, consistency is very important, and so when your data comes across inconsistent, it is a bit of a problem. So where I've experienced these kind of issues are, for instance, in SAP and in Sage 1, where a person has captured a comma in a product name, and you export them, and because it's comma delimited file that you export it to, you now have an extra column, meaning that all your data gets split a little bit further down into a extra column, but only for those specific rows. So you can use the same method and maybe count the commas and in the individual rows and say, well, if there's an extra comma, then it means that in that specific section you have an extra comma, and then it's just to determine where the extra comma could possibly be. Is it in the product because then you can eliminate that comma in the same kind of way with your program running through and deleting a comma where you can see that you have a full name, for instance, or you've got the date but the description sits in 2 columns. Then you can eliminate one of the commas with your program and get it all to fit into the correct format. So the program can be used in many different ways. So thank you very much for watching the video, and if you like it, please like and subscribe. And the code is downloadable from my website, bringmesome.co.za. So you'll find the spreadsheet, the complete spreadsheet there. As I've done the course, normally after the video is done, I would upload it to my website, and I'll put a button there to download it from. Please visit the website, and there's also a whole load of other videos that I've done there, things that's unrelated to accounting, but where there might be modules in those programs that you could use in your Excel for accountants in your daily use. There's, for instance, a gaming section that I've done where I have a piece of code that writes a grid. Now, a grid, if you've ever used cubes, which I used to use a lot in banking, then that would help you a lot in Excel to write a cube where the data might be moving around. Doing a VLOOKUP is not always successful because your data is no longer sitting in the same position, and therefore your column reference might be pointing at the wrong place. So for instance, that program that I use to write cubes for the games is quite a useful thing to be able to use in a business application. You just have to extract it out of that game spreadsheet, and you literally can copy it and paste it into whatever program you are busy with. There's also another one to write sequential files, which I've got in one of my programs called in one of the games called Kingdom. It's a game that I'm still busy writing. And you can download that from there. So I basically use it in the game to write sequential files to allow the game to be played over a local area network, which makes a little bit more sense than actually sharing a Excel spreadsheet, because as we all know, if you've shared an Excel spreadsheet before, it is not without its problems. So what the game basically does is it writes little sequential files to a local area network shared drive, and the other person can pick up the files from that drive. So there's a little piece of code there that also just writes those files just by calling the subroutine. So please have a look around at the other programs that I've written, and I'm sure there'll be new stuff pretty soon, especially in this series, Excel for Accountants, which is my main project at the moment. I'm sure in the next week or two I'll have quite a few new videos coming up. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy your evening. Bye bye.